Hello, my name is Kelly Handy, and I am one of the IRB specialists at UTA. In this section of the conference, I will discuss the basics of informed consent and recruitment and talk about the importance of consent in research. Earlier, we talked about several times that research violated the rights and welfare of subjects because they did not understand that they were participating in research, or they were not given an opportunity to choose if they wanted to participate in research. Because of these ethical breaches, we now have established principles designed to protect research participants. The requirement for informed consent is based on the principle of respect for persons, which is one of the ethical principles described in the Belmont Report. Respect for persons requires that subjects have the right to make informed decisions about what happens to them. Informed consent is defined as the process of communication between an investigator and a research subject, where the subject is fully informed about the research and they are given an opportunity to decide if they would like to participate. This process starts the very first time a researcher contacts the subject, such as through an advertisement, about the study, and continues throughout the entire life of the study. Usually, informed consent is presented as a document that the researcher will discuss with the potential subject to ask them to participate in their research study. During this process, subjects are fully educated about the study procedures in a manner that they can easily understand, including the risks and benefits. During this process, subjects are given an opportunity to ask questions about the study, and they are given a chance to say no or choose to ask more questions before deciding whether to participate. Their voluntary willingness to participate is then documented, and that is typically done by signing the consent form. UTA requires that all IRB submissions involving the collection of data from human subjects to include a plan for informed consent, regardless of study classification or review type, because this is fundamental to protecting the rights and welfare of subjects. Informed consent is a process that involves two parties, the principal investigator and the potential subject. The PI involved in informed consent is primarily responsible for making sure that every subject is properly recruited and undergoes the full process of informed consent. They do have the option of delegating this responsibility to fully trained research personnel, but as the PI, they are still ultimately responsible for the informed consent process. It's also important to note here that research personnel who obtain informed consent should be appropriately trained, very knowledgeable about the research activities, and able to answer questions about the study. So the principal investigator should take precautions to ensure anyone responsible for informed consent is well trained. The investigator or designee responsible for obtaining consent has several responsibilities that are important to making sure consent is properly obtained. Researchers should describe the study procedures and timeline accurately and explain what participation entails, regardless of the complexity of the study procedures, whether it's a survey, focus group, or collection of a biospecimen. Participants need to be given time to think about the study and ask questions before they decide to enroll. The language used should never be coercive and should instead focus on accurately explaining the purpose and the background of the study. Researchers should also avoid undue influence when obtaining consent. What this means is that if a researcher has a position of authority and they are consenting someone in a position that does not have that same level of perceived authority, the potential subject may feel unduly influenced to sign the consent form. An example of this type of relationship is a professor trying to recruit a student. This doesn't mean that a professor cannot recruit a student, but rather that the professor needs to take precautions to ensure the student is not being influenced to participate. The consent form needs to be written in lay terms that someone without a scientific background can easily understand. A general rule of thumb to follow here is that consent forms should be written at an 8th grade reading level. Finally, Consent needs to be properly documented. Typically, this is a signature, but when specific conditions are met, the IRB can approve other forms of documentation of informed consent, such as checking a yes/no box to indicate consent. Consent should be documented exactly as described in your IRB protocol. The informed consent document is required to contain several elements to ensure that subjects are presented with appropriate information about the study. These are federally required elements of consent and should be included in each consent form regardless of the study. The consent form should state that the study is research, the purpose and background of your research, including how long it's going to last and all the research activities, because those things allow potential participants to know if the research is a good fit for them and their lifestyle. Your consent should also explain the risks and benefits of participating, both for the subject directly and for society. This is very important because people need to fully understand the associated risks before deciding to participate. The consent form should also clearly state that participation is voluntary and participants can withdraw consent at any time with no penalty. The consent form should describe any alternative options to participating in the research. Consent should also include a description of confidentiality and explain how research data will be maintained. The document needs to explain who has access to inspect the records outside of the research personnel and explain how any collected paper or electronic data will be kept secure and how long it will be stored after the study is closed. The consent form should also contain information about compensation, or if their participation will incur any costs that they will be responsible for, like parking costs, for example. For research that involves more than minimal risk, the form should also explain whether any compensation or medical treatments will be available in case an injury occurs. Consent forms should also address whether the researcher plans to use their data for future research purposes that are not described. Subjects should know if their samples or data will be stored and used for future research purposes that are not described in the consent form. And finally, consent forms should also include contact information for the research team so participants know who to contact if they have questions or a problem comes up, or if they change their mind about participating in the study. The consent form should also include the contact information for the IRB for questions or to report a complaint about the study. All of these required elements need to be written at an 8th grade reading level in simple language that a non-scientist can understand. UTA has informed consent document templates on our website to fit every study type, and these documents contain all of the required elements of informed consent. Here is a screenshot of our website where you can find our templates we have for different types of studies. Each of these templates contains all of the required elements of informed consent that were just discussed. We have one for adults, we have a condensed version for minimal risk studies, 2 for clinical trials and biomedical studies, one of which is for federally funded studies, and we also have a form for studies with both parents and children. Finally, we have a broad consent template which can be used in limited circumstances for storage, maintenance, and secondary research of identifiable private information or biospecimens where the specific future use is not yet established. If you are unsure as to which template is appropriate for your study, please feel free to reach out to us for assistance. And just remember that when you use our template, always download the most recent version from our website so you don't use an out-of-date version that has old information. So just to recap the last few slides, informed consent is the process whereby a researcher shares information about a study with a potential subject and gives them time to decide whether they would like to participate in the research. After making their decision, participants document their decision by signing the informed consent document. After subjects provide consent, the researchers should also give them a copy of the consent form for their reference. Documenting consent is very important because it records that the researcher appropriately presented consent and that the subject is deciding to participate of their own free will. If you are the researcher, make sure that you are documenting consent in the manner approved in your IRB protocol. Okay, so what we just talked about covers the basics of informed consent for adults, but some studies may also want to recruit children or individuals under the age of 18. Children are a potential vulnerable population because they have limited autonomy and are more at risk of various harms in research, so they require additional protections when they are research subjects. Instead of consent, which we just talked about, children need to provide what is called assent to participate. Assent is the term used to express willingness to participate in research by people who are too young to provide informed consent, but old enough to understand the proposed research and the activities expected of them as subjects. In Texas, and in most states, people under the age of 18 cannot provide assent by themselves. So, if research involves children or minors, the researcher will also need to obtain consent from the child's parent in addition to obtaining assent from the child if they are old enough to understand what you're asking of them. If the age range of the child you are recruiting is older and has the capacity to understand your research, it's likely appropriate for you to obtain both parental consent and assent from the child. In some cases, like if the child is too young or they lack the capacity to understand the research, the IRB may waive the assent requirement. The next thing we are going to discuss is what to do if you need to alter the informed consent process. In some cases, there are elements of consent or documentation of consent that may be waived. The researcher will need to submit a waiver, and the IRB will make a determination on whether elements of consent or documentation can be waived for this specific study. The IRB will review these waivers on a case-by-case basis, and it's important to remember that submitting a waiver does not guarantee that it will be approved. The IRB may grant your waiver in specific circumstances and with appropriate justification, but just submitting a waiver does not necessarily mean it will be approved. The researcher has to provide sufficient justification to the IRB, and that can vary depending on your study. To request a waiver or alteration of the required elements of consent, the IRB will need to see that these 4 conditions are met. First, that the research is no more than minimal risk. The waiver or alteration will not adversely affect the rights and welfare of participants. That the research could not be carried out without the waiver. And when appropriate, participants will be provided with additional information after their participation. Some studies may want to waive documentation of consent. These conditions needed to waive documentation are a little bit different because the IRB will need to see that at least one of these conditions is met. That the only record linking the subject and the research would be the consent document, and the principal risk would be potential harm resulting from a breach of confidentiality. That the research presents no more than minimal risk of harm to subjects and involves no procedures for which written consent is normally required outside of the research context. Or if subjects or legally authorized representatives are members of a distinct cultural group or community in which signing forms is not the norm, that the research presents no more than minimal risk of harm to subjects, and provided there is an appropriate alternative mechanism for documenting that informed consent was obtained. So the type of waiver the researcher submits will depend on what portion of the consent process they wish to alter. The IRB will make a determination on whether to approve the waiver after reviewing the justification that the researcher provides. I mentioned that waivers to consent are determined on a case-by-case basis by the IRB. There are limits to when consent can be altered or waived. I want to go over a few reasons or justifications that the IRB would not accept a waiver or alteration of consent. First, convenience. Researcher convenience or difficulty is not an appropriate reason to justify waiving consent. Participants have a right to make decisions, and it's important that their rights and welfare are protected. Second, cost. Cost is also not a sufficient reason to waive consent because ethical considerations take precedence over cost. Speed. It can take time to cover informed consent with participants, but this is not a reason to waive the requirement. The IRB may suggest ways to obtain consent in a more efficient manner if a researcher is concerned about cost or speed, but these alone cannot be used to justify waiving informed consent. And finally, the risk level alone. Just because a study is minimal risk does not mean the consent is optional. A minimal risk study still involves some level of risk that a participant would not otherwise have if not enrolled. So unless other criteria are met, even minimal risk studies should still obtain consent. If you have concerns about how to obtain consent for your study, I suggest reaching out to our office with any questions because we would be happy to provide guidance on consent and whether a waiver or alteration is a good choice for your study. Okay, so moving on to recruitment. Recruitment is the process of advertising your study to find subjects that are interested in participating. Like I mentioned before, recruitment is where the consent process begins because consent starts the moment a subject sees your recruitment materials. You have a lot of flexibility here to use whatever method or material is necessary to share your study with the public. You can use flyers, emails, ads on social media like Instagram or Facebook, television, radio, or you can simply rely on word of mouth methods to recruit. The researcher should choose the method that makes the most sense to reach their subject population. One thing to note here, if you will be posting on private social media pages or private listservs or accessing information that is not publicly available, the IRB will need to see a permission letter stating that you have permission to access that information or post on that particular site before the recruitment method can be approved. UTA does not have templates for recruitment since this is going to be unique and tailored for each study. While we don't have a specific list of elements that you must have, there are a few general rules to keep in mind when you're designing recruitment material. First, the recruitment documents should be somewhat brief and limited to generating interest in your study. So you'll want to briefly describe the study and the goal in a way that generates interest. The materials should include information about subject eligibility and the type of subject the researcher wants to enroll. So if there's a particular age range or medical condition or occupation, for example, that should be listed on the flyer or other recruitment material so potential subjects can see if the study is applicable to them. Some researchers also want to include information about compensation, which is a good idea, but it is important to not put undue emphasis on it. The material can provide compensation information, but that shouldn't stand out more than the rest of the information. Researchers designing recruitment material should make sure that all the information in their materials is accurate and not unduly influential. This is important because when the IRB reviews your recruitment materials, they will be checking to make sure the benefits to participation/compensation are not overstated or presented in a way that would cause undue influence on subjects. So in closing, informed consent is an ongoing process that ensures participants understand the study and voluntarily agree to participate. This process begins the first time that a participant sees recruitment material and continues throughout the life of the study. IRB approval is required before recruiting participants or obtaining consent. Remember to always use the most up-to-date IRB approved forms. Recruitment and consent must be ethical. All forms used must avoid coercion, use clear language, and prioritize participant rights and welfare at every step of the research study. If you have any questions, you can let us know in the chat, or you can reach out to our office later for guidance on consent and recruitment. Thank you.